Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the forum here at All Saints Church. My name is Mark Chase. My pronouns are he, him, and I have the honor of being one of the associate rectors here at All Saints Church, and I'm just incredibly excited this morning for those of us who are in person and for those of us who are joining online for this morning's conversation. We have the incomparable Reverend Dr. Daniel Lee with us, Professor and Academic Dean of Asian American Studies and Theology at Fuller Seminary. He is an award-winning author, and usually when people say something like award-winning author, they're just kind of propping up the speaker, but this is literally true. Daniel Lee is an award-winning author, and we're going to be discussing his award-winning book this morning, Doing Asian American Theology, as we continue our celebration of AAPI Heritage Month, as we celebrate and center the voices of our AAPI siblings. So it is an honor to tee up this conversation. And look, I talk a lot as a preacher and as a pastor, and so I was thinking, okay, we could do the interview, but then there was someone amongst us in our midst who was not only a member of the All Saints Church community, but who was also a program director in the program assistant. You should have let me give you a promotion right there, all right? But Gillian Garcia is program assistant at the Center for Asian American Theology at Fuller Seminary, and is also a member of our All Saints Church community, and is a mentee of Dr. Lee, and she will be conducting this amazing forum this morning. So after I pray, the next voice that you'll hear will be none other than that of Gillian Garcia. So we're honored to have her moderating this incredible and important conversation this morning. Let's get started with a word of prayer. Spirit of the living God, we thank you as we feel the ground beneath our feet, as we feel the breath inside of our lungs, as we take a deep breath in and take a deep breath out. If you're in this room or if you're watching online, maybe that's the only one you'll take all day. So let's take one more. Deep breath in, deep breath out. God, thank you for this conversation. God, thank you for the history, the legacy of our AAPI siblings. God, thank you for the prophetic witness. God, thank you for the ministry of Reverend Dr. Daniel Lee. God, thank you for the community that has gathered here this morning and that is gathering online and again in this room, even as we speak. Holy Spirit, would you be in our conversation, speak to us and through us. In the name of the Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer, amen.
Thank you, Chase. Good morning, All Saints Pasadena. Good morning. Again, my name is Gillian Garcia. My pronouns are she, her, or siya in Tagalog. And like what Chase said, I am part of the AAPI community or ministry here at All Saints, as well as the 20s and 30s group. Today, it is my honor and privilege to be conversing with my boss and mentor, the Reverend Dr. Daniel Lee. So let's give him a warm hand of applause. Welcome, Daniel. So before we discuss your book, we have so many questions. We're all intrigued to learn more from you and your work, but could you share a bit about yourself to our community, about your family, where you grew up, and what gives you life or joy these days?
Yeah, so as Chase introduced me, I serve as the academic dean. I was a founding academic dean, so I founded the Center for Asian American Theology and Ministry at Fuller Seminary. I'm also assistant professor of theology and Asian American studies. Let me see here. I originally grew up in Northern Virginia. I'm Korean American. I grew up there, and I've been out here in LA for about, 20 years now. So I live in Tampa City with my wife and my 3 daughters. So lots of very strong feminine energy in the house, but I'm getting used to all that stuff. So that's basically what I do. In the meantime, I guess for fun, I like to backpack, hike, rock climb, and things like that. That's basically what I do. So yeah.
And just to give you a bit more information about Daniel, he's the foodie. He knows all the best restaurants in the LA area, all the best Asian American restaurants in the LA area. Just ask him. He has a whole directory of that. So let's talk about your book. Doing Asian American Theology has been receiving rave reviews from different spaces, Christian or academic spaces. And it recently won the award for Book of the Year by the American Society of Missiology. So Daniel, could you tell us why you wrote this book, what the process was like, and if there were any challenges as you were writing this book?
I wrote this book because I needed this book. As I was writing it, I would tell myself, write this book for your past self, right? I knew that this is the book that I needed 20 years ago when I was in seminary, and I felt so lost. And to some degree, in the introduction, I talk about how I felt like I was stumbling around in the dark, trying to make some sense of what is happening, who am I, and how do I do this? How do I make sense of my faith and my identity? And in that sense, and I would like tear up thinking about it. Like, man, if I had this book, if I had something like this, all the detours and just being lost in so many places and kind of suffering through all that stuff would have been kind of alleviated in a sense. So that's how I thought about the book, and in that sense, I had a really difficult time writing the book. I think like people of color sometimes they get into like mental blocks because you kind of think about the famous like white professor you kind of grew up with, and you really can't, like, in your mind, you can't really compare. So you tell yourself, like, it's okay, like you have to kind of go through it. And I've had some great mentors who said, well, that's a real thing. It's a real thing to have that, like, that white theologian looking down and saying, is that real theology? And I just kind of struggled through that. And I've had some great mentors and friends like, oh, you're not crazy. That's a real thing. And you have to keep on going. So, and then I realized that there are parts of it where I just feel like I don't, I come to a section of my book and I was like, I don't really understand this section. So it took me longer than I thought. And so it's been a long journey in that sense. Yeah.
I was one of the beneficiaries of your book, and I'm so grateful for it. And like also Bernard here, my husband, and also a student of Fuller, also your mentor or mentee. It was really helpful for us to deconstruct whiteness in our theology, and you provided us language for it. And yet your book is also essential for us to reflect on our own racialized experiences as Asian Americans. And then in your book, you talked about, you introduced the Asian American Quadrilateral, or AAQ, which is something that you've been teaching your students at Fuller. And could you share to our parishioners what the AAQ is about, and why do you think it is important for Asian Americans and also non-AAPI folks to familiarize themselves with the AAQ?
So one of the biggest problems in the Asian American community is that it's really the erasure of Asian American studies and Asian American history in a society, right? So, my kids know about like a little bit of Black history, like even when they're like second grade, they're basically learning about Rosa Parks and MLK, but they actually learn very little about Asian American history, even though Asian American history has been around for 170 years. So how do you learn that? And if you don't learn your own history, Asian American studies, how do you articulate who you are without that history, right? So as I was thinking about Asian American kind of theology, I was like, well, how does this connect with my faith? I realized we can't even articulate who we are correctly, because when you articulate yourself with how mainstream culture describes you, you are going to stereotype yourself, and that is a serious problem. You will use all the very stereotypical language, kind of crude language, and you will internalize that and use that for yourself, which will basically deform who you are, and that is not beneficial. So what I started out is talking about language, the need for language to articulate yourself, the correct language, Asian American centering language, right? So in that sense, trying to develop a simple way of doing that. As you know, like API community is like incredibly diverse. But how do we do that in such a way so that we can articulate who we are, that having that adequate language? So in cognitive linguistics, we talk about how the language you have forms your world. It forms how you think about the world, how you process your experience. If your language is very limited, and that's how you would describe yourself. I think about all the different languages we have now for gender identity. And that's been really helpful to be like, oh, this is basically what you are. Because before it was like you're normal or abnormal. I mean, that's not very beneficial, right? But you say, oh no, it's a wide spectrum, and you can locate yourself here. In the same way, I think the Asian American community kind of suffered because we say, well, this is actually what it means to be normal, and this is how you're weird, because you have some kind of weird Asian heritage. So how do you articulate that in a very nuanced way is basically how I came up with this idea of Asian American Quadrilateral. I mean, this is literally what happened. One of the professors at Forrest said, what is Asian Americanness? I mean, there's nothing particularly unique about it, because if it's like migration, I mean, everybody migrated here to some degree. What is particularly unique? If it's Asian heritage, then everybody in Asia has that, so what's Asian American? So I started saying, wait a minute, this is very problematic. If we can't locate ourselves and identify ourselves, how will we think about anything? So that's basically when I started by saying, let's kind of break down the Asian American experience into 4 different intersecting kind of areas, themes, right? It's Asian heritage, we share with everybody in Asia. It's migration, we basically share with everybody who's not Native American. It's actually American culture, because Asian Americans are bicultural, right? So we experience all this different stuff, and also racialization, how we Asian Americans particularly experience racialization. When you see the overlap of all 4, it turns out that every Asian American experiences them in a particular way. Now, it turns out that not just Asian American, all of us, all of us are like, this is basically kind of a basic human way of thinking about locating ourselves and describing ourselves. It's just that I particularized it for the Asian American community, but the basic idea of kind of breaking down the identity in different components and saying we live at the intersection, yeah, it's beneficial for everybody, right? If you use that, you can distinguish between Irish immigrants and German immigrants, and say, oh, this is the difference between Somalian refugees and Jamaican immigrants, and recently Nigerian immigrants. You say, oh, and of course Black Americans, right? To say, this is basically what you share, and this is what you don't share. If you only use one theme of race, well, obviously all of us are same, but that's not true, right? You want to basically say, and so one of the biggest things I talk about is that we have multiple identities, and we want to make sure that these identities kind of are all kind of united with ourselves, and we're at peace with them in a sense. And we know how to make sense of them. So that's just very simple way of talking about why we have something like Asian American Quadrilateral, or a way of kind of naming different parts of ourselves.
Wow, yeah. I like how you also mentioned or struggled to, what is Asian American identity, and we don't know what to do with that. So there is a tendency for Asian Americans to essentialize or orientalize ourselves just so we can be represented. And that leads me to my 3rd question, and this is very real here at the All Saints community. AAPI community is just new, refresh. We started with our Lunar New Year celebration, and that was a bit of a logistical nightmare for us because we don't know how to represent ourselves. It's so diverse. We want to talk about, we want to communicate that we're not a monolith. We're very diverse. We're composed of East Asians, South Asians, Southeast Asians, and we don't know how to do that. And I find it helpful that in your book you actually talked about this. In chapter 9, you said that the Asian American experience within the multiracial church space, Asian American experience within church spaces can be a struggle. And you said, if not erased, Asian Americans in multiracial churches can easily become orientalized or homogenized. The particular gifts of each racial group sound good in principle, but it does not work for Asian Americans. There is no one worship style, we know this. There's not one particular language, we know this. It's not Chinese, Mandarin, or Cantonese. And there's not one spiritual practice that can adequately do justice here. So my question here, in benefit of my friends at the AAPI community, is how do we represent ourselves well with justice to ourselves in our, in our community without, holding on to this, tendency to orientalize or essentialize ourselves.
Yeah, so I mean, so the issue of orientalizing or kind of essentializing is to say, oh, this is really the core of who you are. It's basically a kind of reduction, right? So to say, well, being Asian American means you have some, I don't know, like Confucian heritage or whatever. But it's very reductive, right? So the problem of talking about anything Asian American in the U.S. is this, that U.S. society presents the idea of Asian American as primarily, or media does, primarily in terms of like East Asian identity. So imagine in your mind, who is Asian American? You say, oh yeah, like maybe like a Chinese person, maybe a Korean person, right? But that's what you think in your mind. Now, if you actually see a Filipino American, do you say, well, they're Asian? Or do you see if you see an Indian American, like a South Asian, do you say, oh, they're Asian? No, not in our mind, because that's not how stereotypically the media represents what it means to be Asian. Now, if we were in UK, the word Asian means South Asian. That's what it means. So if they see me, they won't categorize me as Asian. They'll say, oh, are you Chinese? There's Chinese and there's Asian. Asian basically means Indian, Pakistani, because of the British Empire. That's basically what it means. And if you look at the demographics, that's what you see, right? That's basically why if you watch, British TV shows, you'll see here's like black, and here's British, like here's some kind of a South Asian, right? Because they're number-wise, demographically, they're larger than the black community in UK. Now think about that. Because of that reality, they tend to when the word Asian comes about in the UK context, they actually mean South Asian. Now in the US, it turns out, so 85% of Asian American population are these 6 groups. But I want you to think with me and to name the top 6 groups by size, okay? The largest group, right, because it makes up 85% of the Asian American population, which is about 6% of, so Asian American population is about 6% of the US population, okay? Number 6, okay, ready? Number 1, largest Asian American ethnic group is Chinese. Number 2 and 3 are very close. Number 2 is somebody say Korean? You're wrong. Japanese? You're wrong. It's actually Indian. Now, we don't even think about Indians as Asians. They're number 2, right? Number 2 used to be Filipino, right? Think about Filipino, because we had a whole empire relationship with the Philippines, right? The early Filipinos weren't immigrating. They were just coming to the center of the empire. Think about that, right? We occupy Philippines because U.S. was an empire, but we don't think about that in history. So Chinese, Indian, Filipino, and then, let me see here, Chinese, and then it's maybe Korean? No. I'm Korean, and Koreans think everybody's Korean. Like, according to Koreans, 50% of Asian America is Korean. Oh no, it's not true at all, right? So it's Chinese, Indian, Filipino, Vietnamese. And then it's Korean. Koreans are less than 10% of Asian American population. But you wouldn't think that by media representation. You would literally think it's 50%. So it tells you that media representation hides what's happening and it erases certain communities. That's why Filipino Americans are like, really, we have such a long history with Asian America and US, but we're literally just erased altogether. People don't even consider us to be Asian American, right? So, and then it's Japanese American. That's basically the sixth largest in a sense. So if you think about that, you say, well, what's happening? How come you don't really understand that demographic? Now, it differs by areas, right? So certain cities and certain kind of areas, you basically have larger, Indian American population or Filipino. We don't have as much Indian American population in the LA area, right? But New York, in Dallas area, they have some decent sizes. But it's basically what the US looks like. And once again, how US tells stories. It's like how black representation. There's a huge black middle class. You wouldn't know it by watching the news, right? Because news tells a particular narrative. And it hides certain realities. So that's basically why to learn about the Asian American community is very different than to have an Asian American friend who might tell you, I'm Korean, half of Asian America is Korean, right? Like my brother, you are misinformed. So I think it's basically part of, how we kind of navigate, right? And the issue about multi-ethnic representation is you always have to say, well, look, a lot of my Asian American friends, they always fret with multi-ethnic worship. They say, what should we do? We need our one thing. Yeah. Do we sing in like one language? Oh, this doesn't work that way. Because once again, look at number 6, right? 6 different things. That doesn't work that way. And also, we're Asian American. Like one of the professors at Fuller asked me, what language will my Asian American class be taught in? I said, well, of course, Asian. I mean, come on, it's Asian American, we all speak English, right? I mean, we're talking about multiple generations, right? So I think people perceive, people don't really understand what that really means, right? I was at a and I hate multi-ethnic conferences and stuff like that. I was at a multi-ethnic conference, and somebody was like, oh, because we had the black communities pray, and we had the Hispanic community pray, and one of the leaders came to our table and said, well, why don't you pray in your heart language? And I was like English? I mean, some of us obviously have, there's multiple languages in our community, but there's a lot of us who just, our primary heart language is your language. It's English, right? So there's a way of kind of foreignizing in a sense and this happens in the Asian American community. And so because we don't have one thing, is it one language? Is it one spiritual practice? Well, if you have such a diversity, what would that be? Well, let's pray in Korean style. I'm like, but that is not what Filipinos do or Indian Americans do. It's a different thing altogether. So that's part of the issue. And if you try to have one thing that everybody has to represent, then it has to be that. I have a professor friend at Fuller, who basically, Trey Clark teaches preaching, and he's into all the a black contemplative tradition, not gospel choir, contemporary tradition, right? It's like a deep contemporary tradition in the black community, but you never would hear about it. It's always a gospel choir, right? It's the issue of representation. If you have to have one thing to represent your people, it ends up being reduced. And that's a problem when you don't really fit that.
Wow, so rich. I'm learning new things today. And I have more questions, but I want to be respectful of our time and open it up. But allow me to just ask this one more question from my end. In benefit of our AAPI community here at All Saints, do you think that Asian American identity formation is possible in a multiracial church such as All Saints? Because I've been in conversations with fellow parishioners here who realize, wait, I'm not just Chinese or Chinese American. I'm actually Asian American. What does that mean? And you suddenly realize that you're Asian American at a multiracial church. So yeah, what does that look like for us to do identity formation in a multicultural or multiracial church? And if that's possible, how can All Saints support this or facilitate this well for us?
The basic issue is this. The basic issue is, can we really see each other? You cannot love somebody you don't see, right? And so, and think of yourself this way, all of us have multiple identities. All of us have, so I was talking to one of my colleagues and saying, because he didn't like being called white. And I was like, oh, when I say you're white, I'm not saying that's all of who you are. There's multiple identities here. You have to own this part of it, but it doesn't mean I'm done. I'm done with who you are. You're a white man. I know all of who you are. I mean, that would be such a reductive, oppressive way of thinking about it, right? It just means, in a racial sense, this is an aspect of who you are, right? And you have to own that, right? But there's more, right? There's multiple identities, right? I mean, I am racially Asian American, but ethnically I'm Korean American, right? And generationally, I'm second generation or 1.5 generation, right? And also, I used to be an engineer. I'm a minister. I'm a professor. I am my own, my mother's son, right? I have my family identity. I'm heterosexual. Multiple identities that I have. Now, certain aspects of my identity will become more relevant than others in certain contexts, right? Jason's over there. In certain parts of the country, when a cop pulls you over, he's just a black man. He doesn't have choice to be anything else, right? Now, he has to own that. But obviously, reducing him to that would be ridiculous, right? That's part of the problem. I think in a place like this, to think of our identities in multiple ways, right? Because what you don't want to do is be like, oh, you're a person of color, so you have more of a complex identity. I'm white, so I have nothing. I'm just generic. That's actually one of the really problematic ways of thinking about it. All of us have identity, right? And actually, I think it's what whiteness has done to different people, right? And even white people. Yeah. Think about German Americans. Ethnically, German Americans are one of the biggest ethnicities in the U.S. But you wouldn't know that because what happened? During World War I and again in World War II, German Americans said, oh my goodness, we are being called terrible things. Some of us are being lynched. We will erase our Germanness. We will change our last names. We will get rid of our German community centers, our newspapers. They literally got rid of them. They had to erase themselves to fit into whiteness, right? So you think about that. What has whiteness done to people? And so that's a loss. It's a loss, right? Because it's a family heritage you have. And I know German immigrants from the Midwest because, unlike the Irish, Welsh, Americans, German Americans are very quiet. They're not loud. Generally, I don't even met people who are Generation German American. They're a lot more quieter, a lot more family oriented, not as individualistic. The heritage is still there, but I think often we kind of erase it as though they're just white. And it's a loss on multiple sides. Now, in certain contexts, their whiteness becomes so big, right, so relevant. So it is true. But if we, in our space like this, can say we have multiple identities, right? And that race does matter a lot, obviously, in society. So we want to acknowledge that because it's a historical thing, right? That you can't just get rid of that. It's a systemic thing. You can't get rid of that. But at the same time, you say all of us have complex identity that we're trying to make sense of. If you can do that, then it's actually very hospitable for Asian Americans to be like, oh, I'm going to own my identity, right? Because if you basically say it doesn't matter, or basically have a very flat way of talking about identity, then why would you own that for yourself? Why would you stick out, right? Because it's a liability. You want to be like, I'm just one of you. I'm just normal. And so if by making it this way, to say this is a complex way of thinking about each other, it makes it very hospitable for everybody to kind of tell your story. So many people who are multiracial these days, right? What are they?
Yeah.
Are they white? Are they black? Well, no, they're complicated. In terms of family lineage, it's complicated. To be like, look, I don't have 5 seconds to understand who you are. I have like weeks, months, to be like, I want to keep understanding who you are. I want to hear your story. I want to be able to acknowledge and be able to see you clearly so that I can love you clearly. Because if I only see what I want to see, like I'll tell you a story about Hmong Americans. You know, like Hmong is an ethnicity, but it's not. There's no corresponding nationality. There's no country called Hmong. So when I first met them, as a Korean American, very ignorant, I was like, "What the heck is Hmong? Like, are you like pseudo-Chinese?" Very crude. This is racist, right? Are you like pseudo-Chinese? Who says stuff like this? Well, this person who's basically ignorant, right? So I'm like, oh my gosh. I look back and I'm like, what was I thinking, right? Just so I'm trying to understand the category, and I didn't come as a refugee. So all the things I don't understand, I'm like, okay, well, let's throw that out. What can I understand about you that I see in myself? That's a very problem. When somebody says, well, I just see you as one of us. You don't want to say that. I want to see you as who you are, right? And to do that sometimes, I had to literally learn categories I didn't have. I had to learn what it means to be a refugee. I had to learn U.S. history to realize Hmong Americans, they came and they were like, U.S. owed us, because we did all of their dirty work. So they're not grateful. They're like, you owed us all this different stuff, so we come proud. Now, because you would think, well, weren't you a refugee? Aren't you grateful for the fact that U.S. saved us? No. That is not what they think at all, right? So to understand that particular heritage and to see them clearly, the fact that they don't share Confucianism, Taoism, shamanism, typically what East Asians share, but they have their own unique shamanism. It's just for the Hmong people. Well, if I have no idea what that is, how do I see them? How do I love my neighbor? So that's basically part of our journey for all of us, to see ourselves more clearly, but to realize the fact that I need new categories, new eyes, new lens, new language to see my neighbor. Otherwise, I'll be like, I don't know what he's talking about. I'll ignore that. That basically means you're ignoring parts of who they are. Like if I said, well, I only think about gender binary-wise, right? I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about with the spectrum, but I'll just set that aside. I'll just see you as one of me, one of us. How reductive would that be? I had to learn new categories to be like, oh, wait a minute here. I'm ignorant about this whole gender categories. I have to learn new categories and what that really means to be able to see you, to be able to learn your journey. And that's basically what the whole community has to be to make the space hospitable.
Well said. Wow. I'm so glad you're here. I feel like this is an accomplishment for me and the AAPI community here at All Saints to bring you here in our space. So now, friends, we are opening this time for Q&A. And
I can run the mic if anyone has a question.
yes.
Okay, right here, Maddie.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I've learned a tremendous amount in just a short time. This isn't so much as a question as just a overgeneralization of an observation that it feels like this country was built primarily on assimilation, and we carry that myth with us to this day. Yet here we are in this cross-section where white Christian nationalism is coming up and trying to return to this idea of assimilation that was forced, it's a mythology of America that is not a healthy, like archetypal, big, inclusive mythology, but this limited, assimilated mythology. And how do we work with that today when we understand that the fabric of the country, it was built on something that was broken and wrong?
Yeah, I think one of the best ways to do that is to, so my daughter was learning about, doing some ethnic studies, right? And she's like, ethnic studies is just American history. It's just, what's Asian American history? It's just U.S. history, right? It's all it is, right? We talk about, well, this is black history. No, it's just American history. I think we have a particular narrative that basically reduces and to realize, wait a minute, this is just our story, right? So if you can recover that and to say, oh, this is not a particular, ethnic people's story. This is just our story we chose to ignore, right? And actually, it turns out, once again, using the history, history of German immigrants, it doesn't even serve white people in a sense, right? It serves nobody. It serves nobody, right? So in a sense, to say, how do we actually have a more robust understanding of history altogether? Like Asian American history. People don't understand the fact that whiteness was primarily against black community, but it got refined against Asian American community, right? When people were trying to figure out in the citizen law, it's like, well, Japanese American person was like, well, am I white? Because I'm not black. They said, oh, no, you have to be Caucasian. And then this Indian American person was like, well, I'm Caucasian, right? Because Caucasia, like this whole myth of like an ethnic myth of India, they're like, oh no, the Supreme Court was like, well, we mean like white in terms of like what average person would say. So once again, Supreme Court is trying to refine what whiteness means against different bodies, right? So you look at this thing and you realize, oh, this is actually just average, just regular U.S. history. When we recover that, you realize it's not as simple as we make it out to be, right? It's not as simple as when the Irish came, they were not considered white, right? So what had happened? Well, people waited. This is like, they waited during the Civil War to say, which side would they fight for? And when they fought for the Union, and the Union won, they said, okay, you are white now. I mean, you don't understand how whiteness ends up changing. There's a great book called History of Whiteness. No, it's a white people. Neil Painter, Princeton historian. Excellent book. Because you can see whiteness changing, being redefined in multiple ways, right? And you're like, this is just U.S. history, and you can see the shifts that are happening to negotiate these things. So when you recover that kind of history, you realize, oh, we have a lot more complicated history than you realize, but it's been flattened. And that flattening is very oppressive. Critical race theory is just history, yeah.
Thank you. Oh my God. I'm trying to formulate the question in my mind. First of all, I want to say whiteness actually does benefit. It benefits the rich people who are in power that want to keep power. So like that's what it's all about, right? But this is just breaking my heart open and making me like so happy to have you here and to hear all the wisdom. And it's, Gillian, it's just making me think about like, how are we sort of forming the API community here at All Saints? And we've been kind of going into it really slowly and saying, let's not declare what we are. Let's figure out who we are. And one of the things that's really standing out to me is it's the education component, because I think you're absolutely right. There's this reductive way of thinking that people, even like really well-intentioned people with beautiful hearts, go like, oh, Asian American, like, and then send us back to our countries, where, and they want to know, like, oh, yeah, like, let's look at the practices in China or in Japan or whatever. And it's like, no, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about our experience here. So, like, who we are here as Asian Americans, and as you're saying, that's not like one thing, right? So where we're kind of at the moment is saying we actually really need two groups for this. We need a group that's just us, right, as Asian Americans, that we get to be in community together. And then there's like a wider group that also includes allies and friends who want to support and engage in this. And that's more for like planning the education of our congregation. So just based on, I don't know, I'm just looking for any like wisdom or advice you have. I feel like I just want to like adopt you and make you come to church every week. But what advice would you have for us?
Well, first of all, I'm your neighbor. right? I mean, Fuller is like a block away. So just holler, just email, right? I mean, I can come like once a month if you want. It's very easy to do, right? It's not like, because that's basically, I had so much things on my plate, but I accepted because I was like, All Saints is our neighbor. So I was like, oh, why am I doing this? This morning I was like, I have so much stuff on my plate, why am I doing this? But because you're a neighbor, right? Because I care, right? This is, love your neighbor. It's like, you're literally my neighbor, right? Yes, you're right. There are a couple of things that's really important. There's so many Asian Americans who have personal experience, but they don't have critical knowledge of what it means to be Asian American. And they don't realize the fact that there actually is a thing called Asian American studies. There's a thing called Asian American psychology. It's been like 50 years old, right? Same time, Black studies started, right? Because ethnic studies overall, Chicano studies, everything, they started all 50 years ago, right? So you realize that there actually is a body of knowledge you can know. That's beyond, I have a Korean friend who might not be very well informed, right? Like having a Black friend, well, they think racism is okay, so I think, no, it doesn't work that way. It's beyond personal experience. We actually need to have critical knowledge. Now, that's actually going to benefit everybody, but there's a way in which the API community here has to process stuff for themselves. So, I mean, like the Asian American Center does this. Generally, all of our classes and everything else is open to everybody. Now, even then, we actually give some guidelines to say, oh, just make sure you don't, there are some basic microaggressions you should learn about Asian Americans. So if you want to be an ally, you should learn these things. This is not you spend some time in Japan, now you want to spend time with us. Those are two different things. Because if Japanese Americans go to Japan, they're like, this is nice, it's a foreign country. That's what they say, because it's not home for them. I mean, like some of them, so I think you have to make a distinction here. It's not a total separation, but there's a distinction between Asian and Asian America, right? And of course, there's a lot of transnational people, but you have to make a distinction first, and that'll help you to make sure that you're protecting Asian Americans and not foreignizing them, because one of the fundamental ways in which Asian Americans experience racism is that they're not American. You're a foreigner just hanging out in America. So if you hint at that, you speak English well. I mean, I don't speak other languages. So I hope I speak English. I grew up in San Marino. I mean, I don't know what you want from me, right? So you don't want to say stuff like that. You might be like, what's a compliment? It's not a compliment. It's incredibly offensive. To tell a third-generation Japanese American, you speak English well. It's ridiculous, right? So you want to be careful about these things. Just like everybody has their own microaggressions. I don't comment on, like for example, I don't touch Black women's hair because I'm not suicidal. I don't want to die, right? There are certain things in certain community you just don't do. In the Asian American community, you don't do certain things. You don't comment on people's eyes. You just don't. Like, well, I was curious. Keep it to yourself, right? Well, I thought they were international. Lean more toward being, if they speak English well, lean more to them being just American, right? Now, given all that, and then they say, oh, they were actually international students. They'll be surprised. But if you lean that way and say, oh, are you from somewhere? And you turn out that they're fourth generation Chinese American, they're going to be offended. You don't want to do stuff like that, right? So Asian Americans, the API community needs some space for them to process. But the allies have to understand basic microaggressions they shouldn't commit. I mean, that should be something that should happen as a whole community, right? And that's basically what Gillian is talking about. Like Lunar New Year. I mean, that's not celebrated by everybody, so it's fraught. Like, okay, that's fine. But you just have to be careful you don't celebrate that as API, because a lot of people, or call it Chinese New Year. It's even like China-centric, right? I mean, that's problematic if you're Vietnamese and call it Tet, or if you're Korean and you don't, that's not what you call it, right? So there's different ways of navigating this thing. I think learning all the different categories and realizing, a lot of us know basic, like anti-Black microaggressions. We just learn it. We just know, oh, these are things that you don't tell Chase, he's very articulate. Because it's a stereotype. Black men being articulate is racist. right? Obama's articulate. For a black man, I mean, no, he's just an intelligent human being, right? So there's certain things you just don't say, but there's a whole slew of those things for Asian Americans, and as a whole community, you should all learn it. Because you don't want to say things and be like, well, how would you say that? That's actually very racist, right? Don't try to speak, oh, I learned some rudimentary Mandarin. I'm going to test it out on this fourth-generation Japanese American. I mean, they'll be like, what are you doing? What are you doing, right? So that's kind of stuff is what you want to be careful about, right? Not to kind of give hints of the fact that, oh, you must be foreign. You might not think that way, but it's in the water and you have to be careful.
Well, we have time for one more question and then we'll wrap it up because this is good news. The Reverend Dr. Daniel Lee will also be preaching at the 10 a.m. service, so he's got to get vested and ready. So one last question here. It's already on.
The first is just an observation, and the second is an observation leading to a question. It's very interesting that in the late 18th century, it was actually proposed that German be the main language of the country. Of course, it failed. But I think that's very interesting. The other is that I've always felt that everybody should have two languages. And a lot of people who are immigrants do just automatically. But it would be nice if that was something that the schools supported. I was lucky, I started French in grade school. And then to get my advanced degree, I had to have two languages. The other one was German. But do you think that this is possible to make it an expectation that people have two languages?
Yeah, I mean, I learned French when I was growing up too. I'm just saying, it shouldn't be a requirement, right? I think there's a problem here in terms of like having the freedom to do so, and to be like, well, you're Filipino, why don't you speak Tagalog or there's multiple other languages. I think the idea is the fact that it's one thing to be kind of like think about yourself as cosmopolitan. It's not to be like, well, this is who you are, so you have to own who you are. Well, there's a wide range of being who people are, so you want to give people that freedom to do so. Otherwise, it's like, well, saying, it's the whole Orientalism, right? This is essentially who you are, so you have to own it. I'm like, really? Where is that written? Which law is that, right? Well, because you are Asian. Well, I don't know. Who are you? What language do you have to own? Well, I'm a mutt, so it doesn't really matter. I'm like, well, that doesn't really make sense either. I think there's an oppressive way of talking about that. It's a way of talking about the fact that we can actually be generally hospitable to every culture, right? So you have to be careful with that idea of language, because people will ask me, why don't you speak your language? I'm like, I don't know, because I'm American. Why don't you speak your language, right? You want to ask me where I'm from? Where are you from, right? So you have to be careful with these ideas, because it's a way. Why do you count generations for Asian Americans? Trump is second generation on his mother's side, third generation on his father's side. Do you count generations for Trump? No, you don't count generations for white people. So you have to think about this thing, how this functions, right? And you'd be like, hey, there's a politics and power in terms of how we talk about these things, and we want to be hospitable. We want to make sure that we're careful, so that even as much as we want to learn different languages, we're not going to be marginalizing people through that.
Can we just thank the Reverend Dr. Daniel Lee, y'all? Incredible. Thank you so much. And like we said, there's going to be more at the 10 a.m. service. Let me get on camera. I'm just a disembodied voice right now. So we're going to head up to service right now. I'm going to say peace to our online crew. Thank y'all for gathering with us. And thank y'all for gathering with us right here in this room as we continue to practice our courageous justice, right? Showing up here on Sunday morning. So thank y'all for being here. And we're going to continue at the 10 a.m. service. All right? Bye, y'all.